Awesome, yeah. Just want to thank my colleagues Nick Talbot, Kim Dirks, and Jenny Salmon for their help along the way. This work wouldn't have been possible without them. So, if we think about a bit of background, we know air pollution kills between 4 and 9 million people every year. But if we start to look at the transport sector and that impact on human health, it kills about 400,000 people. We know that commuters are generally exposed to greater levels of air pollution than those who commute by car or bus. And there are a lot of, interventions and management strategies that go into trying to mitigate this exposure or the harm caused by exposure to air pollution. Some of these things are like congestion charging, but also low emission or zero emission zones. The issue is, though, that evidence base supporting these changes is often conflicting. We don't always know what happens to the concentrations of air pollution. Do we just move the pollution elsewhere? Does it actually reduce? But then also there's that social and economic consequence of the change and that hesitance to implement such zones in cities, because especially car-dominated cities like Auckland, because we love vehicles and we don't like using public transport, and everyone thinks we need to drive. So that evidence base is really lacking. If we think about Auckland, it's like many other cities, transport really dominates in the emissions profile. As you can see up here from 2016, there is a little bit of impact from residential home heating in the winter, but our primary emission source is transport. Other studies have highlighted these hotspots, which are usually near intersections, but also around locations, so intersections here, but also in one-way streets or areas where ventilation isn't so good. And historical studies have showed that median concentrations of ultrafines are anywhere between 17,000 and 36,000 particles per cubic centimetre, but this varies between summer and winter. Winters are usually a little bit higher, again, from that residential home heating. But compared to worldwide, concentrations vary from 8,100 to about 40,000, and then obviously on road and in tunnels tends to be the highest, where we'll see the highest concentrations. I'm sure all of you have probably heard about C40s and what they do to try and help cities combat the climate crisis. Auckland committed to C40s in 2015, and we have committed to halving emissions by 2030 and then trying to achieve net zero by 2050. We've also committed to implementing a zero emission zone, which is this red area here, by 2030, and then a low emission zone or area around the outside of it, so around the edges of the city. And what we did with COVID is we looked at how these successive lockdowns impacted traffic and what reductions in ultrafines we might see if we were to implement a zero or a low emission zone in the central city. So from previous studies, we found that when we modelled the pollution concentrations at the outside of the city, it was what we expected, but on the inside of the city or within the central city, there were kind of some sources that we didn't quite fully understand, and reductions weren't as great as what we would expect. So, and that was from a fixed monitoring station perspective. So we devised this mobile monitoring route. It was about 5 kilometres, took about an hour to traverse the whole city, and it covered streets of different vehicle traffic counts, a few parks in there, but also lots of streets that are going through a lot of change or have been changed previously to try and make them more people-friendly, less car-centric, and so we could kind of track that change through time. There were 2 main measurement campaigns which aligned with our COVID restrictions, one in 2020, August 2020, and then quite nicely, 1 year later, there were some more restrictions imposed in 2021. We supplemented data from the NEWA Flow database, that was Met data, and then also some regional traffic data from our local transport agency. Here is just a breakdown of what the restrictions look like. So our business as usual at the top there there were no restrictions in place. Comparing the Harvard Stringency Index there, so it still had a 22 for stringency index, but there were no restrictions in place, and this was our baseline for what we compared concentrations to. If we think about the two lockdowns or traffic reduction scenarios, as I move through, we refer to them as traffic reduction scenarios. This was our most stringent lockdown or traffic reduction scenario, and you can see that index is about 92, and that regional traffic reduction was about 90%. So this only happened on one occasion that we were able to measure, but then there were two occasions where we had a slightly less strict traffic reduction scenario, where there was still stay-at-home orders in place, but people were allowed to move with a little bit more freedom. And you can see that the stringency index is similar between 70 and 80, but that traffic reduction at a regional level was much greater for the 2021 study, 2021 sample period. So if we think about the traffic, these were traffic counts that we did in the CBD. You can see that quite large reduction from the business as usual to the traffic reduction scenario 1, so about 86%. And these reductions align really well with our regional traffic data. They were slightly greater in the CBD, which may have represented the lesser amount of people actually entering the city, whereas people might have still been travelling around the city. And in terms of meteorology, winds were light and variable, but the only statistically significant parameter that was different across the different periods was temperature. It was slightly cooler in the traffic reduction scenarios. Our mobility changes, looking at our Google mobility data, we had this large reduction at transit stations and workplaces, but obviously that increase in residential people movements as well. If we move on to some results, you can see that in the olive there, you have that traffic reduction scenario 1. So our really strict scenario where we removed about 90% of the vehicles. So that sort of equated to about a 73% reduction in ultrafine particles. But then interestingly, when we look at that less strict scenario, between the 2 years, we had a 23% reduction in 2020, but then a 70% reduction in 2021. And we thought this was really interesting because we expected a difference, but not for it to not be this great. When we compared concentrations for black carbon at the local monitoring station, we also saw similar reductions. When we map this data, you can see the business as usual on the left and the traffic reduction scenario 1 on the right, so that really strict scenario. You can see that reduction in concentrations between the two scenarios. It's not too easy to see up there, but if I go to this map here, when we start to look at the concentrations as standard deviations away from the mean, you can see these hotspots really start to light up. And as we would expect, you have the high concentration zones around our high volume roads and around the port entrance, which does impact the city quite a lot. But also surprisingly around these construction areas throughout the city and the ferry terminal, but also these pedestrianised shared zones. So these zones where there are no vehicles, but we are still getting some of the highest concentrations. You can see that that is reduced significantly under the traffic reduction scenario, but you still have a few hotspots around that ferry terminal. When we broke this down into the street type, you can now see what we would expect, the highest concentrations around the high volume roads, and maybe even our arterial roads, and the lowest concentrations around the parks. But interestingly, if we start to look at the pedestrian and private lanes, so the zones where there should be no vehicles, little to no vehicles, therefore we would think there would be low UFP concentrations. These zones were usually the second highest, or sometimes even the highest, in terms of UFP concentrations, which we found really surprising, and it started to make us think about why there would be these such high concentrations consistently through the study period. And here you can see that positive relationship between ultrafine particle count and vehicle count, which is what we would expect. But again, like I just said, that relationship really starts to break down when we looked at these pedestrianised shared zones. And we really started to think about why this might be, and like other studies, maybe this was trapped pollutants being blown in under the right meteorology conditions. Was it building ventilation and extraction systems? There's also that construction element and shipping emissions. We know quite a lot about shipping emissions, but maybe that construction element we are not capturing as well, and also differences in meteorology. So to sum up, we had a business as usual period that was similar to historical concentrations, but the traffic reduction scenarios really reduced the amount of ultrafine particles that you would be exposed to when you remove cars from the road, which is what we would expect. There was this big difference between 2020 and 2021, and we weren't really sure why, and it was quite surprising. The 2021 lockdown was more stringent, so maybe that contributed to that greater reduction in ultrafines. And we know that removing vehicles from the road is going to reduce the number of ultrafines that you're exposed to within the city context. But are there these sources that are disproportionately contributing to your overall exposure? And do we fully understand them? And how much do we know about linking that urban design in the city, and how is that going to impact your exposure to ultrafines? So further work was as needed, obviously, to understand the role of meteorology, but also the chemistry and the source of these particles. And this is a bit of the next piece of work, which is when we did some filter sampling to try and really understand what these sources might be, and use Raman to distinguish differences in the black carbon or the carbonaceous species in these particles to try and understand where these sources might be from. Just need to thank a few people: Auckland Council, Callaghan, University of Canterbury, and NIWA. A few references, and thank you. There's a link to the paper if anyone wants to read it.
Thank you so much. Very nice presentation. Let me ask the audience, do we have questions?
So when the COVID lockdowns occurred in the southern hemisphere, we were going into winter, and so in the southern states, and so I'm from Melbourne, people had to work from home, and so the traffic was down. But then everyone took to their wood heaters and started burning, more than usual because they were at home all the time. I mean, I guess you would have smelt that, in the air in Auckland. I mean, that's another source
That
that's
would
unrelated to traffic that might have gone up.
that wood smoke signal we did see in the first lockdown, which was in April, so at the start of winter. But moving towards the end, we didn't see that wood smoke signal as much. But it was definitely something we did witness. But obviously, it was hard to quantify with just particle counts.
Yeah, it definitely happened in Melbourne.
Yeah.
Thank you for your interesting talk. So do you have any information on the transition from gasoline diesel to the electric vehicle?
No, I don't have that information yet, but it's definitely something that's interesting and something we're looking into, and the impacts that's going to have on that change in particle composition. Yeah, all I know is that we do have a vehicle fleet that is probably twice the age of the rest of the developed world, so that definitely impacts our air pollution. Yeah.
So ultrafine particles are mainly emitted from the diesel engine. So you have more information.
Yeah.
Better.
Okay, thank you so much again. For the sake of not overrunning our session too much, I would like to introduce the next speaker.